Welcome to the podcast of the FENS Virtual Forum 2020. We'll be looking at the highlights of Day 1, Saturday 11th of July, and catching up with the people behind events. First up, the chair of the programme committee, Fritjof Helmchen. What did it feel like to welcome everyone to the very first FENS Virtual Forum?
I was thrilled because in the end, it's finally real, right? You have been thinking about this for such a long time, preparing for this event, then with the special circumstances, switching to an online event. We would have loved to stay be in Glasgow right now, but we cannot. But we are now very excited that this virtual forum is happening. I'm excited to be here at the virtual forum, and I look forward to the coming days. It was a great time to work with the program committee on preparation of this forum. We had prepared all the speakers and symposia lectures, and then we got hit by the corona crisis and pandemic. So we had to suddenly switch. We were very worried that we would be not having a forum, that in the end it might have to be cancelled. So in the end, we were also very happy with the decision to go with a virtual forum, because then we could really actively work on now shaping this virtual forum the best we could. We had to really convince people and encourage people to participate and really go for a virtual forum. And we were super happy that overwhelmingly people support this. Second, we had to make the big decisions about reshaping the program, because we felt that the virtual forum actually also needs to be more compact. You cannot have it from 7, 8 in the morning till late in the evening. So we had to more compactify it. So we basically then decided to have this core session in the early afternoon times from 1 to 2:30 with the symposia, and arrange things around it. Also, then we had to reshape the poster sessions. So we had, once the posters were in, we had another meeting where we basically decided on the final grouping of the posters in scientific sessions and topic-wise, and then also in distributing it across the program. I'm very much looking forward to the live aspects. That's something that has been very important for me, to try to, even though it's a virtual forum, to try to still foster the active live interactions among participants. So we will not only have the lectures and talks, which are mostly pre-recorded, but we will have the question and answer sessions live, the discussions of the different symposia, for example, and we have the poster presentations live. So with the presenters being at the poster, like in a virtual room, you can step into the poster and have the discussions live there at the poster. So that's one aspect I'm very much looking forward to, and I hope it will be working, that the people can interact and have the scientific discussions as if they are physically standing at the poster. The core is also the symposia session, so please check out the symposia and see which ones are of interest to you. Don't miss the exhibition and the other special events, and obviously the plenary lectures is a great lineup of fantastic speakers. So I can only recommend not to miss any of those plenary lectures.
The Fred Kavli opening lecture was given by Professor Eve Marder. She talked about the differential resilience to perturbation of circuits with similar performance.
Our goal is to try and understand how the brain works, and in particular, we want to understand how the behavior of brain circuits depends on the particular features of the cells and synapses that make up those brains. So we try and go from one level of organization, which are the properties of the proteins and the molecules that give you action of single cells, and then try and understand how those properties and the synaptic connections allow groups of neurons to produce very well-defined behaviors. As you start thinking about the effects of either genetic deletions, mutations, or pharmacology, that it can be very non-intuitive to extrapolate from one animal or one situation what's going to happen with another animal or another case, because many of the effects of manipulations or perturbations are going to be quite specific to the case, the particular set of the parameters in the starting condition. And of course, that explains why there's so much human-to-human variability in therapeutics, especially for things that are designed for mental and neurological illness. But it also makes it more difficult to extrapolate from any one person to any other. But it does make it very clear why psychiatrists or neurologists often have to try a number of different medications in order to find something that will work for that person.
Professor Marder also took time to speak more personally about her country and its response to the COVID-19 crisis.
In the rehearsal that I did for the FENS talk, I said, I want to apologize for all the American scientists, or all of the scientists I'm sure would join me in trying to apologize for what we didn't do. And it's just the harm that we have caused. And it's not that we could have prevented it, but it's just unconscionable. When I was 20 and when I was 16 and 20, I used to be out on the streets protesting in the first part of the civil rights movement. And then in the anti-war movement, I was out on the streets, and I wasn't on the streets now. I mean, I shouldn't do those things. I mean, I'm over 70 and it's just not reasonable to take risks. But I think this is demonstrated more clearly than anything else, how people have to make the importance of science and education evident to every person. I mean, what has happened in the US would never have happened if our educational system had been properly working. So I think we've seen the most clear demonstration of the importance of education and science, because the complete nonsense that's happened here is precisely because of our failures of our educational system and the lack of trust in science as a process. So hopefully that will be a lasting benefit, that people will understand the benefits of science and education, and the benefits and the importance of science and education in our Black and Brown communities in particular.
The EJN special feature was a talk by Professor Anita Luthi about how mammalian sleep varies in space and time. And she explained how her background affects her approach.
I have a degree in both biology and physics. And I was always interested in doing biology in a way that would, allow me to obtain quantitative data, numbers and signals that I can analyze with some physical methods. And that's why I got very interested into neuroscience. I was particularly interested in, what makes neurons generate the spontaneous activity that they need to generate to get the system functioning, be it in wakefulness or in sleep. And in particular in sleep, I was fascinated by the fact that neurons and circuits start oscillating, and start oscillating on their own, and they must generate some inner world, some inner kind of activity that seems absolutely relevant for sleep, because if you disrupt these rhythms, you also disrupt sleep. And more than that, now these rhythms are also important for some of the essential functions of sleep, namely that we get disconnected from the external world, that we can recover, that we can consolidate memory. So my question has really been all around these rhythms and what are the biophysical mechanisms that generate them and how they are ultimately important for sleep. Beginning that we still look at sleep as sort of the opposite of wakefulness, and I have many colleagues who very assertedly say that they are interested in wakefulness and not at all into sleep. And I think this is really something that we should become more soft on, because I consider more and more also there is more and more evidence that sleep is very much a behavior, a fluctuating behavior as wakefulness as well. So I think we are all aware, if we have to pay attention to something for a prolonged period of time, our attention fluctuates. And sleep shows these similar features as well. The way it interacts with the world is not simply disconnected and passive and coma-like. In contrast, there is an active mechanism assuring that we keep interacting with the world while asleep. So this research started a few years ago when we came across, I think, some most fundamental dilemma of what sleep has to deal with. Namely that sleep, on the one hand, has to let us recover and disconnect us from the world so that we are no longer receptive for external information, but we can process and restore internal information and also recover from fatigue. And on the other hand, also to remain vigilant to the environment and not to be too disconnected. So these two aspects seem not really well reconcilable. No, they seem to be going against each other. And what we found then, and using mouse as a species to look at this, is that sleep is organized in fragility and continuity periods in a sequential manner. And this on an infraslow timescale of about slightly less than a minute. Where repeatedly we go through periods where we are so-called continuous, so we are really in a state that we are protected from the environment, and then these fragility periods that are the moments where we are more receptive to external stimuli and also may wake up more easily. That's a very fundamental question that I also try to allude to in my talk, namely that having recognized this division of sleep, and I want to specify here also that this is non-REM sleep, the non-rapid eye movement sleep, is that it provides us with a temporal raster based on which we can identify some of the most fragile moments in sleep, where we are most vulnerable to perturbation, where also internal pathological processes might actually hijack on and capture these fragility periods to then promote the wakefulness. And we all know very well that insomnia disorders, some of the most perturbing aspects of insomnia disorders are not only that we cannot fall asleep, but that we do fall asleep, but we keep waking up. And understanding what brings us to this threshold that we wake up more easily will be greatly helped by further understanding of the fragility periods.
Our next highlight is Symposium S12, which considers the lack of female representation and the importance of sex differences in neuroscience research. Dr. Deepak Srivastava and his team have been studying the effects of estrogens on cognition and found different mechanisms in males and females.
It really starts to point out that that there are potentially different routes, if you wish, that the same effect can occur. And this is not to say that one route is better than the other, it's just they're different. And this could have implications both for our general understanding of physiology, I think, but also if we want to extend it to thinking about how we consider neurodevelopmental or psychiatric disorders or the treatment of these disorders. For some time now, there's been a greater appreciation that we need to consider both male but also female animals in research. I mean, I think our findings, as well as the findings that are being presented in the symposium, are really building upon a real emergent field and an abundance of evidence that really speaks to the same sort of idea that males and females utilize distinct mechanisms. We are seeing from both publishers as well as funders this requirement to be explicit about whether or not we're using both male and females, and if we're only using one sex, to justify why and to make it very clear that we're only looking at one sex versus the other, because in the long run the interpretation could be very much influenced by which sex you're looking at. If we just look at everything from epidemiological studies to clinical studies, we know that there's often a disparity between the number of males or females that are affected by certain psychiatric or developmental disorders. Similarly, we know that there's differences in symptomology and even in treatment response. Now, if you just focus on the treatment response, you could simply ask, well, why does the treatment seem to be more effective in one sex over another? And it could be fundamentally due to the fact that the drug that is being given could be acting slightly differently in males versus females. And without this better understanding of the fundamentals that, of how the different sexes work in physiology and health, we will not understand necessarily the pathophysiology. Is it the same in males and females? It very well could be different, and therefore maybe we do need to subtly, or maybe more than subtly, modify the treatment approaches, the therapeutic strategies that we're developing to really account for these sort of differences. And this could help to improve treatments and improve the lives of individuals who have these disorders. There are some very nice editorials that have come out in the last few years that have really kind of spoken about this, the importance of including sex as a variable specifically in preclinical research, because often they're only looking at one sex, or in certain studies they've used both sexes. And this, if we think that there's a different mechanism in play, it's possible then that the effects are obscured, and a drug which may be useful in male or in females may not then be allowed to progress to clinical studies. On the other hand, there's also studies, early phase 1 studies, phase 2 studies, where drugs have been used, but because of the way that the criteria is set up, sex is not considered as a variable, and therefore a drug, again, which may be actually incredibly effective in one sex over the other, is not allowed to progress and potentially have really beneficial effects, because right now it's considered, most drugs are evaluated at the level of, can they be useful for both males and females? So I think, again, the understanding of the importance is really emerging, and this is why particularly funders and indeed, as I said, publishers are starting to ask that we are explicit about how we consider sex in our studies. And I hope that this will, as well as the sort of findings that we've been finding, as well as the others that are being presented in this symposium and other initiatives around the world, it's going to really help us develop and guide us to a better understanding of how we actually do this sort of research, and how we include sex basically in our research.
Our last highlight from day 1 is the brain debate. We caught up with debater Professor Irene Tracey and moderator Professor Trevor Robbins, who explains his cunning tactics.
We've got two very promising young scientists, one who's an assistant professor in Lausanne, and someone else who's, I think, a postdoc in King's College London. And they're going to be constantly monitoring the audience for questions on the chat channel. And they're going to be curating these questions and feeding them to me at the most appropriate time. Just when because I'll be, of course, speechless after a while. My mind will go blank. But I'll fortunately have these brilliant young scientists who will be able to say, ask them this one or ask them that one. And that will keep the show on the road. The context of the brain debate at FENS is to engage everyone in FENS, from students, postdocs, to senior investigators, in issues which, interest us all, basically. And the issue in debate this year is, what brains do you want to work with? Do you want to work with the human brain or a tiny brain from another animal? What's the best brain to work with? Strategically, if you're trying to answer different questions, when do you choose one brain rather than the other brain? And this leads also to all sorts of political issues about how much funding should be put into these different brains. On the one hand, you've got medical applications, for example. On the other hand, you're just trying to find out something about the brain, something, rather abstract, which may not have any application at all. So how do you divvy up the cash pots for funding these different types of research?
as Trevor said, this is going to be a great opportunity for us as neuroscientists who all share the same passion for our love of neuroscience to come together and deliberately try and provoke a little bit of debate and discussion around what are the right systems and models that we should be working on. Are we all given the same bite at the cherry in terms of, again, funding opportunities? And for me, I'm at what's sort of the more translational clinical end. So I work in the human brain, I use brain imaging. So for me, I'll be making the case for translational research, its importance not just in neuroscience for the clinical diseases that affect the human brain, but also how you can translate how we understand how the normal brain works into other aspects of society. So very much on that end of the spectrum, although like many scientists, we all understand and appreciate each other's areas. So we're all going to take particular positions in this in order to stir up a bit of discussion, a bit of debate. And it should be good fun.
Mostly interested in what Gilles Laurent has to say about funding these areas, because he's dug up some statistics which show clearly that there's a lot of funding for work with rodents, for example, and far less funding for work with some of the small brains like Drosophila, zebrafish, and worms, basically. And that's interesting. I mean, that type of work is generally used to discover new principles, really, about neuroscience and the brain versus translation. On the other hand, although he's dug up these statistics, it's not that clear how many people work in these different areas. And without those numbers, you can't really argue too strongly, I think. But it will be an interesting discussion, I'm sure.
All the people that have been selected are fantastic, so I'm excited to listen to all of them. I guess as everyone's always interested when you come to a meeting like FENS is to learn something in an area that, you know, is least close to what you work on. That's where you get sort of excited and enthused about new areas. So, you know, there's a particular researcher, Guan Li Ming, who's going to be talking about organoids, and that's something which I don't know too much about. I mean, so again, as ever with these big meetings, not just the debate, but more generally at FENS, often you'll find particularly people slightly more aged in their careers. It's a wonderful opportunity to go and learn something new and discover. So for me, I'm particularly interested in that presentation, but notwithstanding the rest I'm really excited to hear too.
That's it for this time. Join us again tomorrow for Sunday's highlights from the FENS Virtual Forum 2020. This podcast was made with the support of the Dana Foundation.